In this video, I'm going to talk about how to cut custom shapes, particularly for 3D box construction. I put together these little simple boxes and the wedding cake boxes in other videos, but people often ask, gee, how do you cut the boxes so they're so square and fit together nicely? And when they're really big and have windows in them, how do you cut them to prevent those forms from misshaping? Same question often applies to other types of window cookies like those I use for my Fabergé egg. Easily misshaped if you cut them and transfer them off a work surface onto a cookie sheet. So how do I do it? I'm going to explore that in this video, and we're going to talk specifically about how I created this window shape for this larger box and then this non-windowed but very square looking shape for the smaller box. Okay, first of all, starting with the shape itself. Don't feel confined to one cutter. Chances are if you're doing a big box like these, you're not going to ever find a cutter, off the shelf that fits your needs. So in those cases, what I often do is create templates for myself to cut the shapes. And this is the template used to create the bigger box. I start with a drawing of the dimensions I want. I often fit it together on paper first or cardboard first. Once I've got the dimensions set, I'll take some acetate, this I got at the craft store, set it on top, trace the image on it and cut it out. And then I use this as my cutting guide. Now, if you're going to make a ton of boxes, cutting by hand is really time consuming, so you might want to get this template made into a cutter, and there are places that'll do that or you can make your own, but that's the subject of another video. Okay, so how do I cut this? The key thing is I avoid transferring the dough from work surface to cookie sheet, so I cut directly on a silicone baking mat, which I prefer to parchment paper because parchment paper can kind of buckle. So I've actually rolled this out on the silicone baking mat. The other advantage of that is I don't have to use any flour because these will pop right off the silicone baking mat without, and that tends to have less of a drying effect on the dough. I am working with my rolled gingerbread cookie recipe, which you'll find on my website. I like it because it's got a mixture. Some people just shudder when they hear of shortening, but it's got shortening in it. And that shortening has a higher melting point than butter, so it tends to spread less. So this particular dough holds its shape really well as compared to a really buttery sugar cookie. Though if you've got a lot of flour in any recipe or you drop the leavening a bit from the norm, that can also prevent spreading. So I'm beginning to cut the cookie, and as you'll see, for these big long sides, rather than using a tiny paring knife, I'm just doing one straight up and down cut. I feel like I get the cleanest cut that way as opposed to dragging the knife. But when I want to go around the curved edge, and I've just got the template lightly on the dough. You might want to actually lightly flour the template because it has a tendency to stick to the top of the dough. And I'm not pressing on it hard because I don't want the template to stick in the dough. For the curved edges, I do kind of a series of, you can do one fell swipe or a series of up and down motions. Now before I remove the template, I typically remove all of the surrounding dough. And we'll use this again, so you don't ever have to throw any of this away. This will get balled up and I can roll it out again. And that's again another advantage of not having flour on this mat, is that I'm not introducing flour each time I roll, so I can use it over and over again without toughening the dough. I'm just going to ball that up, move it to the side. And the reason I haven't taken the template off is because if I have any ragged edges, which I don't really on this shape because I do have a little extra dough that I'm cutting off. But around rounded edges, sometimes the edge can be a little ragged, and what I'll do in that case is typically take a smaller knife and just pat it in against the template to kind of smooth that edge so it bakes smoother. And then pull off the template. Got a little extra dough. I'd like to move dough away from the sides that could bake into it. Now this one had a window, remember? I cut that beforehand. I usually choose a cutter that's slightly bigger than the actual window where I want it to be because it will spread a little bit and close in as it bakes. The exact dimensions for this again will be on my website. But I'm gonna cut this out first because if you were to cut this out on your work surface and then try to transfer this whole piece, this would most surely misshape in a really kind of horrible way. And it's really important with these box pieces that they all be as uniform as possible so they fit together nicely in the end. And again, I want to remove all that interior dough so it doesn't bake into the surrounding dough. My paring knife is good for this. Trussing needle can also help to get out the really small stuff that I can't get with my knife, but my knife is doing a pretty good job. I definitely want to remove these pieces because the cookie will spread into them. It's not that you can't get them off later, but why do that if you don't have to? Okay, so again, matting up pieces, saving our dough. And I'm just going to flip this around and show you how I cut the smaller box shape. Similar concept, but I didn't use a template for this one. Instead, I got creative with cutters I had to create a new and different shape. I started with a rectangular cutter, which is the standard one from the Atico set. So this is off the shelf. And again, removing my dough, typically before I pick up the cutter, just because this also prevents me from putting my finger into the side of the cut dough and misshaping it, because I've got this edge as a safeguard until I get all this dough off. So that's another reason for doing it. It's a little messy here. For these big pieces, I can usually fit 2 or 3 on a cookie sheet. So these I do more as signature items, maybe as a centerpiece at a party, or as a special gift as opposed to doing a lot of them en masse. And now to create that little fluted edge, I took a plaque cutter. Again, this is standard off the shelf. And I just cut down about 1 inch from the top to create this nice little effect on top. So you can get creative with cutters in terms of creating custom shapes for your boxes. Okay, so that's ready to go into the oven. I bake these for about 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes, depending on the size of the cookie at 375. Okay, these are fresh out of the oven. And as I pointed out before putting them in, even if they start out with the straightest of cuts, and even with a dough that doesn't spread all together too much, there can be some bulging along the sides. And so what I do while they're hot from the oven is take 2 large spatulas and just push them in gently. And that's often enough to square them up, and I'll do that on the bottom, square it up enough that it will require a little shaving and little filing when we get to the final box construction. I'm going to do the same. This one actually looks pretty good, but I am going to do the same on this particular cookie. Now you don't want to wait too long because the cookies will set. I still have it on the hot cookie sheet because I'm trying to prolong just the time that they stay warm, so I have more flexibility in terms of how long I have to do this. But once they're squared off enough, I would slide them onto a cooling rack to cool, and just make sure you choose a cooling rack that is very flat, because these will cool into whatever shape the cooling rack is. And again, you want these as straight as possible for box construction. So I've just slid it right onto my rack. I'll move this tray out of the way so you can see how that looks. And I'd let these cool partially, maybe a couple of minutes before I'd attempt to move them off the silicone mat. I don't cool completely on the silicone mat because it traps some moisture in between the cookie and the mat, and that can soften the cookie. So 2 to 3 minutes is usually enough to actually pull these off the mat and directly onto the rack itself, which allows for a little more air circulation. And I'm going to just do that now to show you how I would move these, because again, these are pretty big cookies. So you don't want to, mess them up in this final process. So again, I'm taking a very large offset spatula, one that supports the whole cookie basically, and just sliding it over, never really lifting it. This one's smaller, I can lift it safely. So that's the best way to actually cut, bake, reshape if needed, and handle rectangular cookies intended for box construction. In one of my future videos, I'll show how to put all these pieces together to create these fancy boxes. Till then, live sweetly.